Today I'm going to walk you through step by step the process to winterize an RV with a tankless water heater. This is a very thorough process. It goes beyond the basics because basic winterizing can miss things, and I'll show you throughout the video some common fail points on RVs that I believe are related to improper winterizing. Now, before you winterize, please watch this video all the way through. Everyone's RV is a little different. At the end of the video, I'm going to cover some of those nuances that may help you out before you even start the process. If you have a water heater with a tank, this is not your video. Tanked water heaters need to be bypassed, and that is not a procedure we're covering in this video. I will put a link on the screen right now to a video that involves winterizing an RV with a tanked water heater. One more thing before we get started, because there's a lot of conflicting information out there. Not all tankless water heater manufacturers recommend using antifreeze. You should always refer to the manufacturer's owner's manual for your specific tankless water heater winterizing process. This video is for the tankless water heaters that the manufacturer recommends running antifreeze through. For now, let's start at step number 1. Empty your waste tanks. You can argue dumping tanks should be done last, and I won't necessarily disagree with that, but the reason I mention this is many of you may not have access to dump your tanks at home or wherever the RV is going to be parked for the winter. If that's you, remember to completely empty your waste tanks and close the valves before you park it. Antifreeze will naturally go into these tanks once we start pumping it through the lines. That's okay, but what we don't want to do is leave waste and water in these tanks over the winter. It's going to dilute the antifreeze that does go into the tanks, and diluted antifreeze is very ineffective. Even if it's a small amount of waste and water that won't expand enough to crack the tank, it's still sitting at the bottom against your blade valve. Freezing around that valve could warp the blade and cause leaks, so it's best to just empty these tanks. With the waste tanks empty and the dump valves closed, the next couple of steps involve prepping the RV for winterization. We will need to use the water pump, which works on 12 volts DC, so make sure you have power at your coach battery. Most of you will, but if you don't, you'll need to plug into 120 volt AC so your converter can run your water pump. If you don't have a 30 or 50 amp RV pedestal set up at your house, you can simply run an extension cord from one of your house or garage outlets and connect to the RV with a 15 amp dog bone to power your converter. This dog bone, as well as all the other products in this video, will be linked down below. If you have slide outs, go ahead and open them up so you have full interior access. Close your propane tank service valves. Turn off all your appliances, especially your water heater and water pump. Close all faucets inside the RV as well as exterior faucets, areas like outdoor kitchen sinks and spray nozzles. Before even opening the antifreeze, I like to get as much water out of the RV as possible. Now, some people will push the water out with the antifreeze. I just like to eliminate any chances of mixing or diluting the antifreeze. So let's start by opening our fresh water tank drain. I do this now so I don't forget later. No antifreeze is needed here because we can simply drain the tank. I leave the fresh water tank drain open for the rest of the process. I'll show you why I do this later. Next, we can start draining the water from the pressurized part of the plumbing system. Open both your hot and cold low point drains. Low points will be 2 lines under the RV with either plugs or valves, almost always right next to each other, and usually color-coded red and blue for hot and cold. This is the exact purpose of low point drains, to drain all the water out of the pressurized plumbing system at its lowest point. Now, gravity draining at the low points will not drain water in the lines that's already past faucets, valves, or vacuum breakers. So with the low points still open, head inside and open every hot and cold faucet. Everywhere water can flow, all sinks, all showers. There's a vacuum breaker on the back of the toilet, so flush the toilet as well. Head outside and do the same thing. If you have an outdoor kitchen sink or spray ports, open them up. There'll be a pressure and temperature valve on your water heater, commonly called a P&T valve. Open that too. Opening the low point drains first accomplishes 2 things. First, you have the entire plumbing system opened up. There are no vacuums holding any significant amount of water in the lines. Second, we put very little water that was in the lines back into the waste tanks. That will be important later on, and we'll cover that later on in the video. Now, one area this process won't drain is a water filter canister. If you have aftermarket water filters that are positioned before where the water actually enters the RV, no worries, just drain and remove that filter assembly and put it in your house over the winter where it won't freeze. Now, if you have water filter canisters hard mounted after where the water initially enters the RV, remove the canisters, dump the water out, remove the filters because you don't want to be filtering the antifreeze later. You will have to to replace the canisters so antifreeze can continue through the filter assembly to the plumbing lines. Another filter you may have hard plumbed in your RV is a UVC filter for your drinking water. I confirmed with Blue Technology you can run antifreeze through their UVC filter as long as the UVC light is powered off. I can't confirm that's the case for other UVC filter manufacturers, so it might be worth checking if you have a different brand. This next step is kind of optional. I will explain at the end of the step, but this is what I do next. Close everything you just opened, both outside and inside. The P&T valve, all sinks and faucets. Close your hot side low point drain, but leave your cold side open. You will need one of these adapters that will connect a standard 1/4-inch air hose nozzle to a garden hose thread. Switch your wet bay valve or valves to the city water setting and set your air compressor around 40 psi. Once you connect this, you'll notice air and water coming out of the cold side low point drain. Just like gravity draining, I start with the low points to extract water without putting it back into the waste tanks. Let this run until you're not seeing any significant amount of water coming out. Close the cold side, open the hot side, and repeat. Hot and cold separately. Sinks, showers, the P&T valve, outdoor kitchen sinks, spray ports, and don't forget the toilet. Let air through every water access point on the pressurized plumbing. The only difference here is I want to concentrate that air pressure on one valve or faucet at a time, so I close one before I open the next one. Once that's done, disconnect the air line from your wet bay. Okay, the reason I say this is an optional step, there's a lot of twists and turns throughout the plumbing lines that create airflow resistance, and water has surface tension, so your pipes are never going to be completely free of water. Compressed air will remove more water than gravity draining, but I have winterized in the past with antifreeze without blowing the lines out first. Out of caution, I've added this step. It's personal preference, but I want as many layers of protection as possible. These things are not cheap to fix. Okay, so quick recap. The waste tanks are empty, the fresh water tank is empty, or will be empty shortly if it's still draining, and the plumbing lines are empty. We need to close everything back up so we can pressurize the system with antifreeze. Close all the faucets, close the P&T valve on the water heater, as well as the low point drains. My RV has a standard water or wet bay panel, sometimes called a simple panel, has one water inlet and a valve that directs that water to either the fresh water tank or directly to the pressurized plumbing lines. If you have a complex panel, usually in the form of a Nautilus system, some of the valve locations and configurations may be different because there are different versions of Nautilus panels with different capabilities. I'll be demonstrating everything on a simple panel, but I'll explain what we're doing as we go for those of you with a complex panel. In either case, make sure your valves are set to use pressurized city water and not the fresh tank fill. You will be using a non-toxic, food-grade, plumbing-safe antifreeze. Do not use automotive cooling system antifreeze. It is ethylene glycol-based and it will kill you. There are two main types of RV antifreeze, propylene glycol-based and ethanol-based. Now there are some blended versions, but what you really want to try to find is the propylene glycol. It's basically odorless, it's better for the seals in your plumbing system, it's non-flammable. My personal choice is propylene glycol. You also want to make sure the freeze protection far exceeds the expected temperatures in your area. I can't tell you exactly how much to get because it depends on the length of your RV and, more importantly, the length of the plumbing lines in your RV. If this is your first time winterizing, I would pick up 3 to 4 gallons. You can always use unopened bottles next year. And one more thing, this is important. If you have specialty equipment in your RV, things like an aqua-hot hydronic heating system, a washing machine, a fridge with an ice maker or a drinking water spout, anything that runs water through it, you will want to refer to those owner's manuals for the proper winterization method. They will all have their own specific procedure, so I can't possibly cover them all today, but once you know that process for that specific equipment, you could work it into the winterization process we're covering in this video. There's a couple different ways to get antifreeze into the system, but most modern RVs with standard panels will provide an antifreeze input hose right here at the water pump. Locate your water pump and you'll hopefully find a short stretch of hose that goes to nothing. So on this RV, the antifreeze hose works on a stop valve system. Water from the fresh tank comes in through this line here. When this stop valve is parallel to the line, it is open, water flows through and into the water pump. you'll see a pipe T between the valve and the water pump, and this is another valve that leads over to the antifreeze hose. This valve is perpendicular to the line. That means it's closed, and it has to be closed under normal operation, otherwise water would be shooting out of the antifreeze hose. So what we want to do here is close the valve coming from the fresh water tank by turning it perpendicular to the line, and then open the valve on the antifreeze hose by turning it parallel to the line. Now when we turn on the water pump, antifreeze will come through this hose, through this valve, and into the water pump, and it will not go back into the fresh water tank because this valve is closed. You may instead see a system with two-way valves instead of stop valves. Under normal operation here, you have a line coming from your fresh tank through this two-way valve and into the water pump. If you turn this valve, it will close the line coming from the tank and open access to the antifreeze hose on the other side of the valve. There may be some other valve configurations as well, but in any case, all you're doing is blocking the water pump's ability to draw water from the water tank and opening the ability for the water pump to draw from the antifreeze hose. Now, if you have a simple panel, but you don't have an antifreeze hose at your water pump, you can buy a kit that you plumb in one time and use every year. I'll, of course, put a link to that below. If you have a complex panel, you may be able to siphon the antifreeze into the system right at the panel. You'll need to check your specific Nautilus manual to see if your panel can do this, because remember, there are different Nautilus panels with different capabilities. 99% of you are going to need more than one bottle, and switching the hose from bottle to bottle once they empty can get a little bit messy. So I just put all my antifreeze in a 5-gallon bucket. It's much quicker and cleaner. We're about to turn on the water pump and pressurize the system with the antifreeze, and this is where I want to stop and take a second to explain the process of winterizing a tankless water heater. Unlike a tank water heater that needs to be bypassed, a tankless water heater has no tank, obviously. Water comes in and travels through a series of pipes, typically copper, that loop up, around, and down through a heat exchanger where the water is heated and then is pushed out to the hot faucets. Winterizing a tankless water heater is simple. You treat those copper pipes inside the heat exchanger no differently than you treat the PEX pipes running throughout the RV. That's why you don't normally see bypass valves on tankless water heaters. There's no tank and therefore no need to bypass anything. All this intricate piping in the heat exchanger is also the same reason using only compressed air is not a viable method to winterize a tankless water heater. All these different twists and turns in the heat exchanger creates airflow resistance, as we already discussed. Water droplets left in the line will pool and eventually settle in areas that will crack when they freeze. Now, if you're one of those people who don't like leaving antifreeze in your system over the winter, you can simply drain the antifreeze out at the end of the process, and I'll show you what that involves at the end of the video. For the last 5 years, I've been able to keep all of our videos free. I refuse to charge a membership fee on this channel, and I want to keep it that way. Without sponsors, there are no videos, so I hope you'll stick around for a short message from today's video sponsor. RV Snap Pads have become one of the most popular RV products over the last few years, and now they're available for travel trailers. Snapjacks simply replace the metal foot of your scissor jack, giving your stabilizers up to 274% more surface area, and that means more stability and less sinkage into soft ground. Made from recycled tire rubber, they provide better grip than a metal foot, especially on loose and uneven ground. Snapjacks protect not only your RV landing gear, but prevent scratching, gouging, and rust staining to your driveway or campsite pad. Use the link below and get 10% off your RV Snapjack order. Okay, with the antifreeze hose in the bucket, let's turn on the water pump. You will see the antifreeze level lower in the bucket. The water pump will shut off when the lines are pressurized, but leave the water pump power on. Go to every faucet in the RV and cycle the antifreeze through. Remember, hot and cold are separate lines, so you'll want to open each side individually until you see a steady stream of antifreeze coming through. Once you do, turn that specific faucet off, it's done. Do this at all sinks. When it's time to do the shower, put the shower head on the floor near the drain to avoid shooting pink antifreeze everywhere. If you have a shower head with multiple spray options, run antifreeze through each option to get all the water out of the head. Don't forget the toilet, and make sure to leave an inch or two of antifreeze on the top of the ball valve to keep it lubricated over the winter and to maintain that vapor barrier between the black tank and your bathroom. Once the inside is done, you'll want to run antifreeze through any faucets outside. If you have an outdoor kitchen or spray ports, they also need to get winterized. I'll also burp the T&P valve on the water heater to push some antifreeze through there. Once I've run antifreeze through every single water access point on the RV, both hot and cold, I'll just crack open the low point drains one last time to make sure there's no residual water sitting down there. You can add some antifreeze into all the drains to protect the P-traps if you want, but you've kind of already done this when you ran antifreeze through the faucets. I'll now turn off the water pump and immediately clean any antifreeze in the sinks, the shower pan, or on the countertops. Now the pressurized plumbing lines are winterized, but an RV can have non-pressurized plumbing lines that aren't connected to the pressurized side. What that means is because they're not connected, we can't run antifreeze through those lines using the water pump. If you have a black tank flush valve on your RV, that line is almost always separated from everything else. So if you've ever run water through this line, it should also be winterized. There should always be a vacuum breaker on this line. This device prevents any contaminated water from the black tank backflowing back into the fresh water source. For vacuum breakers to work properly, they are positioned on a plumbing line anywhere from 6 to 12 inches above the flood rim, or 6 to 12 inches above the highest fitting on that line. That means the vacuum breaker is usually plumbed upwards. If you've spent any amount of time online talking to other RV owners, you'll quickly discover the vacuum breaker on the black tank flush line is a common fail item. I'm a believer this happens at least sometimes because this line is not getting properly winterized. Additionally, because this line travels uphill, there is potential for water to be sitting in the pipe between where the pipe rises and the check valve at the inlet. If you have a check valve at your black tank flush inlet, some RVs do, some don't. So I like to get any water that's inside this line and around the vacuum breaker out. So to get the water out, you can start by removing the screen filter, and if you do have a check valve, you can press it in and release the water. But remember, this is a non-pressurized line, so doing this only releases as much water as gravity will pull out. Next, you can use the blowout plug I used earlier to push some compressed air through the line, 40 psi of air for about a minute. This black tank flush line and other non-pressurized lines are much shorter than the combined length of the pressurized lines inside the RV. There's also not as many turns and fittings, so compressed air is a viable method on the non-pressurized lines. Now, if you don't have an air compressor, I'm going to show you another way to winterize the non-pressurized lines later on in the informational section at the end of the video. Another non-pressurized line is the fresh tank gravity fill, if you even have one. Now, this line should mostly run downhill, and water really shouldn't be sitting in here, but I will always blow a little air through here just to be safe. We have one more line that hasn't gotten winterized, and that is the line from the wet bay over to the water tank, aka the fresh tank fill. This line should also be, in theory, level or running downhill, but as you can see here, that's not always the case, so we're going to winterize this line just to be safe. To winterize our non-pressurized fresh tank fill line, we need to switch our valve over to the fresh tank fill. Before you do that, remember you are not supposed to switch these valves under pressure, and currently our lines are pressurized with antifreeze. There's a couple ways to relieve pressure. You can open a cold faucet in the RV, or you can simply open the cold side low point drain for a couple seconds, let it depressurize, then close it back up. Now, with no real pressure in the lines, we can switch the valve to fresh tank fill, and just like the other non-pressurized lines, you can blow out the line for a minute with air. If there's still water in this line, you will probably see water coming out of the fresh tank drain. This is why I said earlier in the video, I leave the fresh water tank drain open for the rest of the process. I'll show you why I do this later. Let that run until the fresh tank stops draining and disconnect your air. You don't have to switch any valves at this point. You can leave everything as it is until it's time to de-winterize. Now, if you don't like leaving antifreeze in the lines, you can simply gravity drain the antifreeze from the entire system. To drain the antifreeze, you might want to put a bucket under your low point drains this time, but simply repeat the steps we used earlier to gravity drain the water out. Open the low point drains, let them drain, then go through and open all the water access points inside and outside the RV. Don't forget to open your P&T valve on the water heater, just as we did when we drained water out of the system. But there's one exception here. You don't have to flush the antifreeze out of the toilet, since that's water you're never really touching. And we want to keep antifreeze on our ball valve over the winter. If you want to even go a step further, you can blow the antifreeze out of the system using compressed air. Just follow the same steps we use to blow the water out of the system. And no, I would not recommend using the antifreeze in the bucket next year. Once propylene glycol makes contact with air, it can start to lose its potency, or at least its shelf life starts to decrease. But don't dump out that antifreeze. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now, inside you may still get some residual antifreeze drips at the faucets. I put some paper towels in the sinks under the faucets and put the shower head on some paper towels on the shower floor. Something to note here, before we introduced antifreeze, we gravity drained and blew out the water in the lines. Now, most of that water came out of the low point drains outside the RV, but a small amount of water did go back into the waste tanks. Yes, that water is mixed with the antifreeze that followed it, but that antifreeze is now slightly diluted. It's such a small amount of water in a relatively large enough tank that if it does freeze, it's not going to expand enough to damage anything. However, if you want to be extra cautious, dump your waste tanks one last time and close the valves. If you don't have a place to dump your tanks after you've parked the RV, I'll show you a little trick in a minute. And last, if you drain the antifreeze from the system into a bucket, again, I would not be comfortable using that antifreeze next year, but something you can do is pour that antifreeze into your waste tanks this year. You don't need antifreeze in an empty waste tank, but putting a little bit of liquid in there will help everything from drying out and sticking inside the tank, just as it does when we add water back to the black tank after we dump it while we're camping. Your plumbing is now winterized, but I want to cover some nuances involved in the winterizing process. I also want to answer a few questions I know a few of you are going to have, so let's dig into those now. If you don't have an air compressor, you can pick up an antifreeze pump like this one. One side connects to a garden hose thread, the other side goes into the antifreeze bottle, and you can pump antifreeze into the non-pressurized lines instead of air. This is fine for lines like the black tank flush port, but I'm just not a fan of running antifreeze into the fresh tank lines. Even with an RV level and the tank drains open, tanks don't always completely drain. I'm not going to get into all the reasons why this happens today. Let me just prove it to you. This is older footage, but after emptying my water tank on a previous RV, I ran air through the fresh tank fill line 2 minutes later and still had water coming out of the bottom of the tank for almost 5 minutes. Now, some of this may have been from the fresh tank fill line, but definitely not all of it. I would recommend anyone who owns an RV and winterizes their RV to purchase an air compressor. It's a necessity in my book, and I'll link to a small, affordable air compressor down below that will do the job. If you're okay with running antifreeze into the fresh water tank, just remember when it's time to de-winterize, flush and rinse that tank thoroughly before you sanitize it. I've seen a lot of confusion on this next one. Yes, antifreeze will freeze, sort of, if you go out in the RV over the winter. Depending on your local temps, you will see the antifreeze in the toilet slushing up. That's normal. What's not happening is the expansion that you would get with freezing water. What is more important is that you get an antifreeze that will protect a temperature lower than what you'll see in your area. Instead of using the antifreeze hose, why not just pour antifreeze into your fresh water tank and use the pump to draw it out through the system? Again, we're going back to the idea of putting antifreeze in your fresh water tank. It's possible to do, I'm just not a fan of this method. If you don't have a place to dump your tanks at home or wherever you park it over the winter, you can simply put a bucket under each faucet when you gravity drain and blow out the water in the lines. This will prevent any water from going back into the tanks, and you won't need a reason to dump your tanks at the end of the process. Should you leave your fresh water tank drain open or closed? I've done both and never had a problem either way. I currently leave mine open so the tank can breathe a little bit in the winter. Similarly, if you drain the antifreeze, should you leave all the faucets open? Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I know some people who close them, some people leave them open, no issues either way. I always leave them closed. Last, your RV may have different lines and valves and locations than what you saw in this video, and that's the reason I went into detail today. So you can understand how these systems work. Locate every single line, faucet, and valve that water flows through and make sure it gets winterized. If you have questions, leave them down in the comment section. I hope this video helped you guys out. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.